So constant electricity outages are a way of life for us in South Africa. This was meant to stop when the Kusile and Medupi power stations came online. Kusile was expected to be ready to generate 4,800 megawatts 6 years after the project began in 2008. But in 2021, Deputy President David Mabuza confirmed that Kusile would only be fully operational by 2023, 15 years after the construction program began, 9 years behind schedule. In that time, much has been uncovered, corruption and incompetence. That's taxpayers' money, grossly mismanaged, none of which helps us today for these days and weeks without power. Meanwhile, those in leadership are still there, those who approved the projects, some of those who mismanaged them are still in power, earning full salaries, while ordinary South Africans like you and I suffer the consequences. Chris Yelland is an energy analyst and engineer. He's been following the catastrophe for over a decade. Is there any hope, Chris, of a consistent supply of power from alternative sources in the near future?
Yeah, you know, we've come to accept this load shedding that we've been experiencing since 2008 as some kind of normal, the new normal. But I must say it's not normal in any way. And the reality is there are solutions. If we do the right thing and follow the right methodologies and use science and engineering and technology and facts to address the problems and put aside our ideological past, as well as you know, the way we've done things for 100 years.
Chris, let me stop you. Let me stop you, because you're saying some very interesting things. When you say put aside our ideological past, because that's the barrier, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, you see, the world of electricity has changed radically in the last 5 years. You know, energy tends to change very slowly, the world of energy and electricity. But in the last 5 years, the world of electricity has been turned on its head. The way we used to do things for the last 100 years is not the way we're going to do things in the future. Just to give an example, in the past, the electricity generation has been based on meeting demand, which is a variable. It's not constant throughout the day, but demand is met by what we call base load generation, which forms the majority of the generation. Then we have mid-merit generation, which is like the daylight hours. And then we have the peaking power, which is the morning peak and the evening peak. These three different generation technologies we use to meet demand. And it has now been turned completely on its head because baseload power, which used the cheapest power for baseload used to be coal and nuclear, and this is no longer the cheapest source of power. In fact, it's probably the most expensive. And the cheapest source of power now is renewable energy from wind and solar, which means we should be taking as much of this as we possibly can to meet demand. But we know that these renewable energy sources are variable. So coupled with this variable source of cheap generation, we need what is known as flexible power generation. And that comes in the form of gas to power and battery energy storage and pumped water storage. And the combination of flexible power together with variable renewable energy now delivers the least cost way of meeting the demand, which, as I say, is variable from nighttime to daytime, during the day, in the morning and the evening.
You can't be the only one that knows this. There must be smart engineers working at Eskom that would have known this. Why haven't we done it?
Well, we seem to be trapped in an ideological past. There's a lot of vested interests who have put a lot of their investments into coal. So, in fact, the coal mining industry has been one of the great successes of black economic empowerment in South Africa. And there are many new black-owned companies that have mortgaged their future by buying up old coal assets that the coal majors have been divesting themselves of because they know very clearly the future of coal, and they've been getting out of coal. And the new owners are so heavily mortgaged and invested in this that their entire future depends on this coal-fired power continuing.
So you're saying our country is being held to ransom by this particular scenario that you've just painted. So 52 million people are subject to what's happened here, where you say black empowerment companies have mortgaged their futures to coal. The rest of us have to make sure that they get a return on their investment. That's what you're saying.
Well, it's as I say, there are many vested interests, and the coal mining interests are very powerful and very strong. There's an entire industry of trucking coal from a diverse range of of coal mines to power stations. And again, these are very powerful vested interests that are determined, for example, to retain that transportation industry, even when there are cheaper ways of doing things and transporting coal by conveyor from a coal mine to the power station. So these vested interests are really vested in, they are the status quo. They are bought into the status quo, and they really resist change to a new and a disruptive future.
So you've just opened this big can of worms, and unfortunately I wish I had the time to delve deeper into it. Let's talk about something practical. There are people struggling today with the fact that they haven't had power for many weeks. We've been to El Dorado Park, we've been to other parts of the country, our journalists have been there. People are really struggling. What should South Africans do that is relatively inexpensive, if you can help as an engineer, to try and solve their, not just short-term problems, because it is a short-term, but it sounds like it's going to continue for a few more years. What can they do right now relatively cheaply?
Well, look, ultimately, people have got to, I guess, start taking ownership of their own future. If we're relying on utilities that are failing, if we're relying on municipal distribution networks which are crumbling, we're going to be eternally disappointed. So we've got to start thinking of ways in which we can secure our own energy futures. This is particularly important for small businesses. Many businesses operating from home these days, and no longer is it simply an inconvenience to be without power for a couple of hours a day. It's affecting one's livelihood. And so it's time to start looking at investing in solutions that can secure your power supply. Everything from a small petrol generator, which is not ideal, through to a battery storage system that gets charged when the mains is on, and you can discharge it and provide light and power to computers when the power is off, through to a solar PV system on the roof that is used for charging your battery storage system. Of course, it comes with capital cost, and many people just don't have that cash flow or disposable income to invest in this. But businesses are going to have to start to think about these things, because if they don't, they'll be losing income.
So aren't there entrepreneurs in South Africa who should take advantage of knowing there's this gap for a cheap alternative power supply? Have you heard of anybody doing something clever that, is within the reach of most South Africans? Because certainly the PV solution and the generators are far too expensive for ordinary South Africans.
It's becoming, the business case is becoming more and more compelling. And one doesn't need to go completely off-grid. In fact, that's the wrong solution. But one can identify in one's own house what is a critical load and what is a nice to have, and separate the two. And you only need to provide backup for your critical loads. So, for example, your people with a swimming pool pump motor, that's not critical. Many people can move away from electric stove to a gas stove. People can put in solar hot water geysers. And when you finally boil down to what are the critical electrical loads in a house, they're not all that big, and therefore you can invest in a small system to start off with, and slowly over time grow this. And to answer your question, there's an entire industry that is growing now to meet these requirements for supplementing one's own power needs. It's growing very, very fast, and it's going to grow faster as the price of electricity skyrockets and as the performance of grid electricity gets worse and worse.
Chris, I've been told that my time with you is up, which is unfortunate because I still haven't got to the question about those design flaws that have left us where we are. I'm going to have to ask you to come back again to speak to eNCA viewers about that particular story, because it's a fascinating insight where you employ professional companies And then the design is screwed up for some reason, and we are where we are. We've got to find out more about that. So I'll talk to you again sometime.